Buenas tardes. That's my Spanish. I appreciate that you'll listen to me in English, and I'll try to be as clear as I can. This is a paper based on some work, or a presentation based on some work I've done with Stephen Rodbury, who's at the University of Oxford, but it's also based on the Violence and Social Order books that you just heard about with Doug North and Barry Weingast. It's about sort of the nature of long-term economic performance, but instead of talking about why countries grow faster or slower, I'm going to talk about how over the long term, what causes economic growth is not an increase in the rate at which economies grow, particularly an increase in the rate of growing, but a reduction in the rate at which economies shrink and the frequency with which they shrink. And so it turns out to be a very simple arithmetic problem. There's no high-tech computers, major theoretical breakthroughs. You just add up the numbers and you see it's the reduction in shrinking that begins to cause modern economic growth and development. If that's the case, and we've invested so much intellectual resources in understanding growth and very little to understanding shrinking, then we may not actually understand how to get economies to grow or societies to grow and develop. So the first part of the talk will just be about the numbers and what we can learn from the long-term historical record, going back as far as 1300, some of Leandro's numbers and Steve's numbers. And then in the second part, I'll talk about the causes of the reduction in shrinking. Why is it that when development starts, shrinking goes down? We'll talk a little bit about some alternatives like technology, the structure of economies, particularly the shift from agriculture to industry, Malthusian dynamics and population growth, or the decline or rise of war. It turns out, I'm not going to spend very much time talking about those because they're really not consistent with the shrinking pattern. So instead, I'll talk a little bit about institutions and how in the modern world, that's a little bit harder to say. In the developed world, the countries that have managed to get sustained economic growth are all places that have been able to move towards what we might call impersonal rules, rules that treat everybody the same. Now, obviously, in no society are there any rules that are perfectly unbiased and perfectly equal. But in some societies, there's almost no rules that are that way. Who you are, your social identity, really matters. And that was in part what we discussed in the Violence and Social Order book, why in some societies identity matters so much that you need to have personal relationships with people, you need to know who they are, and how that enables societies to control violence. It's building up relationships between people. I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. And when you see that, if you have a society in which social relationships depend upon who you know and their personal identity, it's impossible to have rules that treat everybody the same. Because I don't know who you are, I'm not going to treat you the same, as if it's just hello citizen. Of course, there's hello comrade. That may not have worked out so well in some cases, but the idea of treating everyone the same has a dramatic effect on the dynamics of society. So in the first part, I'll talk about shrinking, and in the second part, I'll talk about dynamics. I'll talk about how societies perform through time. So this is very simple. When I talk about economic performance, I'll talk about the growth rate in per capita income over a long period of time, 40 or 50 years. When I talk about the growing rate, that will be the average rate of growth in the economy when the economy is growing, and the shrinking rate being the average rate of shrinking in the economy when the economy is shrinking. And then the growing frequency is the share of years in which the economy grows. The shrinking frequency is the share of years in which the economy shrinks. So the shrinking frequency is 1 minus the growing frequency. So this isn't very complicated. And it's possible to write a function which says the long-term rate of economic performance, G, is just a weighted average of the shrinking rates and the growing rates weighted by the frequency of the two. So if you shrink more often, you grow less. If you grow more often, you grow more. And then you can break this down into the contributions of growing, which is 1 minus the shrinking rate times the growing rate. That's the growing rate times the growing frequency. or the shrinking contributions, which is the shrinking frequency times the shrinking rate. Okay? And it's an identity. There's nothing fancy about it. We just want to know how much of the performance of the economy over time is caused by growing and how much is caused by shrinking. If we think about per capita income, prior to 1800 or so, growing and shrinking pretty much had to balance each other out because there was very little long-run economic growth in economies. But since 1800, rates of economic growth have taken off in some countries. And when I mean taking off, I don't mean 10% like in China. I mean 1.5%. So the United States has grown at 1.5% per year in per capita income since about 1840. And that's how we became extremely wealthy, by growing very slowly, but steadily. So what I'm going to talk about here will give you a sort of quantitative basis for that intuition that slow, steady growth is the route to getting rich. Not growing rapidly for a short period of time and then shrinking. So I'm going to talk about 3 data sets here. This is from the Penn World Tables. That covers countries from 1950 to 2011. There'll be another version out in a few years that'll cover a few more years. We have data on 141 countries that all have been in the Penn World Tables since at least 1970. So there's a few early entrants. And what the table shows is the contribution of growing, that is the growing rate times the shrinking, times the growing frequency in the first column, the contribution of shrinking, which is the shrinking frequency times the shrinking rate in the second column. And so those are the numbers you really want to look at. If you think, well, the rich countries, and the countries are sorted by income, the top column is over $20,000 per year, that's in 2005 dollars. And then on down, 10 to 20, 5 to 10, 2 to 5, less than 2. You can see that there's no real relationship between the contribution of growth and your level of income. In fact, to a certain extent, the slowest growing group in the table is the poorest people, but the next slowest group is the over 20,000. It's the richest group. So, and there's just not much relationship there between how rich you are and how much growing contributes to your growth. The key, however, is in the second column. As you get poorer, shrinking contributes more to your lower rate of growth. In the third column, that's the net rate of change in per capita income over the Penn World Table, so 1950, 1960, 1970 to 2011, over that at least 50-year period or 49-year period. How much did you grow? As you can see in the table, the net rate of change, net rate of growth for the first 3 groups is about similar, which means that incomes in the world are getting farther apart. Because if you have $40,000 a year per capita income and you grow at 2%, your income goes up by 5 times more than if you have $4,000 a year and your income goes up by 2%. And then at the very bottom, it starts to get small, and it's getting small because of shrinking. Variations in the rate at which you grow explain nothing here. It's variations in the rate at which you shrink. Now, you may be saying, well, this is just a cross-section, and it is. It's just a sample of countries at the end of the 20th century, and maybe the poor ones shrink a lot because that just happens to be a feature of poor countries. Or so how do we disentangle that? How do we know whether I'm poor because I shrink or I shrink because I'm poor? The correlation is definitely there. So what we want to do next is to look at countries over time. And as it says, I often do this with my slides, I speak it and then I click the clicker and my next slide comes up. Growing is uncorrelated with income. Shrinking is negatively correlated with income. So here's the same data for a much larger time period focused on the developed world, pretty much the OECD countries, as well as basically Europe plus the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. This was data put together by Angus Madison, and it has, as Leandro said, some of these things are guesses, and some of them are not. But you can see the top row gives the growth rate in these four periods, 1820 to 1870, 1870 to 1910, 1910 to 1950, 1950 to 2008. And as you can see in the top row, the only period for these 18 countries that really are growing faster is the 1950 to 2008 period. So these were countries that had started to grow sometime in the 19th century. They were growing on average about 1.4, 1.3% per year. But the next two rows give you the contribution of growing and shrinking. Again, this is the contribution of growing is the growing rate times the growing frequency. The contribution of shrinking is the shrinking rate times the shrinking frequency. And as you can see, over the time periods, nothing is happening to the growing contribution, or it's going up and down a little bit. But the shrinking contribution actually goes up between 1910 and 1950. That's the period of the two wars and the Great Depression, where there's a lot of shrinking and growing going on, and then falls to 0.16. So the difference between this number and this number is what's explaining the increase in growing. It's the reduction in shrinking. And in fact, what's happening to these countries is as they begin to grow, growth rates and shrinking rates go down. So as we'll see in the next table, over long periods of time in developed countries, they tend to grow at about 5% per year, or 6% per year. They tend to shrink at 5% per 6% per year. And whether they grow in half the years or two-thirds of the years explains whether on net they have growth or not. As development ensues and income starts to rise, it's the shrinking rate that falls. Growing rates actually come down. So the contribution of growing is not positive, it's probably negative. It's the contribution of shrinking that explains everything. And here, the contribution of shrinking explain almost all the increase in economic performance over the time periods. So this is a bad table, right? There's too many numbers to see. But this is data from Leandro for Spain, from Steve Broadberry for Great Britain, from Van Zet and Van Leeuwen for the Netherlands, and from Italy. And this takes the data from 1270 to 1348 in the first column, based on a whole variety of creative ways of estimating income, all the way up until 1870. And I'm going to the next slide here, just focus on the 1650 to 1870 time period. So if we look in Britain, the growing rate from 1650 to 1700 was 4% per year. When the economy was growing, it was growing at 4%. The shrinking rate was 3%. So the net growth rate in that period from 1650 to 1700 was about 1%. But notice, it was growing great. When they were growing, they were growing. So it wasn't like in the Middle Ages or earlier that when they didn't grow, it was because there was no growth. They grew fast. But there was an offsetting shrinking going on at the same time. So as we go across, I have a pointer here. In each 50-year period, you can see the average growing contribution, and it's going down. The shrinking contribution is also going down. The increase in the growth rate, actually there's not much increase in the growth rate here, is let me take that back. The non-change in the growth rate. Growing is falling and shrinking is falling. That tends to be the story, that when we get to modern periods, growing slows down and shrinking slows down. And the reason we get growth is because shrinking falls by more than growth, by more than growing. Here's the numbers for Spain. And again, we see the same thing. It's very large fall and shrinking. So that when we look across countries, right, growth is becoming less positive in this period from 1650 to 1870. And so as countries grow more slowly, what leads them not to shrink is the fact that shrinking is going down even faster. So we go back to this one, and we look here. This period of World War II and the Great Depression has the most rapid shrinking and the most rapid growing. And in fact, if you track the numbers, what you see is periods in history where there's high growth rates are typically periods where there's high shrink rates. The two are related to one another. I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in a few minutes. But as we get to the beginning of the modern period, and we start to get growth, what happens isn't that the growth rates go up, they typically go down by a little bit, and it's the shrinking rates that really fall. Okay, so growing and shrinking rates have been high and variable through most of history. They remain high and variable in less developed countries today. Less developed countries typically grow at 5 or 6% when they grow, and they shrink at 5 or 6% when they shrink. The middle income countries have done so a little bit by reducing their shrinking rate, largely by reducing their shrinking frequency. They shrink in less years. The countries at the bottom of the income distribution grow about as fast as they shrink, and they shrink about as often as they grow, which is why they have per capita incomes that are so low. Improving long-run economic performance over time, then, this long-run performance has not been because of an increase in the growing rates. It's because of a decrease in the shrinking rates and the shrinking frequencies. And in fact, long-run economic performance has typically been produced by declines in short-run economic performance. The short-run growing rates have gone down rather than going up. Does anybody have any questions about these numbers? Yep.
Yeah, and just a clarification. If we say it can sustain growth, will that help?
Yeah. So this is definitely sustained growth. Yeah. The question is whether sustained growth is made up of rising growing rates okay, and the evidence for that is clearly no. So that when we look across time periods and we see sustained growth beginning in the early 19th century for Britain and the United States, or in the 20th century for some other places, is it because the growth rates are going up? And the answer is no. The growing rates are going down, the shrinking rates are going down, and the shrinking frequency is falling, and that's what's producing the sustained growth over the long run. So sustained growth is not caused by better performance when you're growing. It's caused by a reduction in the frequency at which you shrink. Okay? Now, if you, yep. Was that a question? Oh, no, okay. So if you, I don't know, I have a PhD in economics. If you go to graduate school, you don't hear any about this. All you hear is about growth rates. You have models which have per capita income as a function of land, labor, capital, some inputs, and then they grow. And so its growth gets better or worse, but it very rarely is a negative thing. But when you actually look at the numbers, you see all this shrinking. What happens in the developed world is the percentage of years in which you shrink go way down. The rate at which you shrink slows way down, and that's what's propelling the long-term economic growth. So how do we understand how some economies and societies have economies that shrink so much, and how do we understand, I mean, we have to understand why they shrink so much first before we can understand how they shrink less and therefore grow. Answering the question of getting countries to grow more rapidly is not a question about getting them to grow faster. It's a question about getting them to shrink less. If you do economics, you'll never learn the answer to that question. It's not because economists are dumb, it's because we've not considered the problem in this framework. We really haven't looked at the numbers over the long run, and we just presumed that when economies began to grow, it was because they got increases in their sustained growth rate. Because if you calculate long-term differences and look at the long-term differences, yes, the long-term rate of growth has gone up, but not because the growing rates have gone up, it's because the shrinking rates have gone down. So what I want to talk about is just a very simple framework of Smithian growth. So Adam Smith identified the gains from specialization and division of labor, the famous pin factory, and how we can make a market bigger and enable more specialization and division of labor, we can get larger economic outcome from the same amount of resources. There's still Schumpeterian growth, there's technological change, new machines, airplanes, spinning jennies, automobiles that contribute to that growth. But when we actually look at the sources of growth, if we take, for example, technology, we can measure for some countries total factor productivity, that is the productivity of the factors of production. That turns out to be very low, and it turns out not to change very much with the shrinking process. That is, total factor productivity has not jumped up in the modern period to drive growth. And it doesn't appear to be connected with shrinking. We could say agriculture and the shift out of agriculture, which is very cyclical, into industry might be a cause for the reduction in shrinking, because agriculture depends upon the weather. Weather is highly variable, so an agrarian economy is going to have lots of shrinking. It turns out, because we have the numbers for England going quite a ways back, that you can look at the variability of agriculture, which is highly variable. In fact, even in the modern world, output in agriculture goes up roughly as often as it goes down because of the weather. But if you take agriculture's contribution to growth, and you say, let's hold the share of agriculture constant and look at what's happening to the shrinking, as opposed to holding the shrinking constant and look at what happens to the share, it turns out that for agriculture's contribution to growth is all on the shrinking part, not on the share part. Even though agriculture is highly variable, it shrinks less in the modern world than it did in the earlier times. We can look at not at industry. Industry is the exception. Trade has a very high rate of growth, but it has lots of variability. It goes up and down. And again, you can do the same kind of thing. Is growing trade causing more or less shrinking? Turns out it's the within trade variation, not the share of trade, that's explaining the economic performance over time. Interestingly, manufacturing or industry is the one place that actually gets positive growth. In other words, over the long term, increases in manufacturing have caused, it's the growing portion of manufacturing, the increase in output that's contributed to economic growth over the long term. So if we look at technology, it doesn't work very well on the shrinking side. If we look on the structural change, it doesn't work very well on the shrinking side. A little bit about manufacturing reducing shrinking, perhaps. The shift out of agriculture doesn't explain reduced shrinking, because agriculture is still highly variable. If we look at Malthusian forces, we would expect to see when the population goes up, income goes down. And if we have societies that go through Malthusian cycles where they press on the resource base and income falls, we would expect to see that when we got a more stable population, we should get more stable outcomes and perhaps less shrinking. But when we actually go back and look at what happens to those factors, we see in Spain, an economy in which the population falls, income doesn't go up, it goes down, because they're not a land-constrained economy for much of the time. When we see England, we see the population, when we see income growing, it's happening as population grows. So we get higher fertility and lower mortality. That causes the population to grow at precisely the time that income in England is growing. And in fact, when the demographic transition hits in and fertility starts going down, that's when the economy slows down. So the Malthusian cycle driving income fluctuations would tend to say when population goes up, income should go down. When population goes down, income should go up. But when you look in the record, that's not what you see. It is true you see Malthusian cycles, and you do see relationships like the Black Death causes income to rise. But the long-run pattern of growth we can see from Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and Britain, Malthusian factors are not dominant. In fact, modern economic growth is being caused by breaking out of the Malthusian cycle. And the same thing we get when we look at war. Yes, sometimes there's more wars and sometimes there's fewer wars. Wars tend to be very disruptive, as we saw for the period from 1910 to 1950. But again, there's no systematic gain there. It's not like you have a war, you kill lots of people, income goes up. When you have a war and you kill lots of people, actually income goes down. War causes both more growing and more shrinking. So that if you get a period, for example, you take Germany in the 1920s and 30s, they have significant negative growth experience, and then they catch up. So my friend Mansur Olson talked about the rise and decline of nations, and he talked about how Germany and Japan were growing rapidly in the 1950s and 60s. That's partly because they were really poor in the 1930s and 1940s, and they had a lot of wartime destruction. So that their war tends not to, it contributes to variation, certainly, but it tends not to explain this differential pattern of shrinking and growing. It causes both. It doesn't cause growing to be bigger or shrinking to be bigger. It causes them both to be about the same. So there's not a persistent pattern there. So what might we be able to do? Well, In a Smithian world in which you have the size of the economy growing, and I'm going to take out technology and war and Malthusian and just talk about what would happen if we have an economy of a given size and look at how well it's connected. And we have elites. Elites could be the king's children, or it could be the aristocrats, or it could just be people who are talented and able and rise up through the system. So they start out poor, they end up rich. They have more control over resources. In an economic system, in a Smithian sense, the people who sit at the nodes in the system, where the connections are made, are typically elites. Right? They control the movement of goods and services. They're able to leverage their position. So we're going to have economic elites, but we can just call them economic, political, social, whatever kind of elites. And I'm going to assume there's 6 elites, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we suppose that there's impersonal rules, that is, the rules treat everybody the same, so that we get elites can make rules based on contracts, so they can all trade with one another. And so we have 30 possible elite combinations. So these are, I put a 1 in there, I'll come back to the 1 in a minute. These are all contracts that can be written by these elites. And every elite can write, they don't get to write contracts for themselves, although they could buy a life insurance policy or something like that. But basically fill up the whole board. Now, suppose that you have a system in which you have rules, and the rules are enforced, but you're in an environment in which powerful individuals are dangerous. So you want to create a situation, Leandro and I are both the elites, so what do we do to promise not to fight, to promise to maintain our agreements? So what we said in Violence and Social Orders is, cut the world down the middle. Everybody on this half belongs to me, everybody on that half belongs to Leandro. Now, Leandro and I make a promise not to fight. If I fight, what happens to the productivity of all my people? It goes down. Who bears the cost of that? Me, since I own you, right? In a simple kind of way. So Leandro can see that I have an incentive not to fight because we've constructed property rights in the people and the land and the buildings around us so that if I fight, I'm going to pay a cost. Now, this is not a perfect arrangement, okay, but it can provide stability in a world in which there's all this shrinking going on all the time. The problem is, it's got to be me and Leandro. We can't just pick somebody at random. We have to have an ongoing relationship in order to make this work. So in that kind of society, we can have rules. In fact, we could appoint some of you judges and some of you priests to be involved in the system, but how that rule is written and how that rule is enforced will depend upon your identity. So some people will get privileges. Some people, nobody will walk backwards, will turn their back on the king. People will recognize the right to own property in certain kinds of ways. People will recognize obligations to pay certain kinds of taxes and certain kinds of services. There'll be distinctions in society. There will also be biased enforcement if you get to a contract. So we write a contract, I'll talk about a promissory note example, and we get to court and it turns out you're the judge's cousin, right? Or you're in the right family and you win, or you're in the wrong family and you lose, okay? Because we've constructed social identities out of organizations, we've used those organizations to provide some kind of social order, and now we can have rules, and the rules can actually be enforced, but part of the rule is the most powerful guy wins. And we can count on that. So now we're going to just order the elites by their status. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What this does is creates a paradox of privilege. The more privileged you are, the less able you are to bind yourself by a legal contract, in the simplest terms. So let's think about a promissory note. In a very common problem in economics is what's called the theory of the firm. So again, Leandro and I want to be business partners, and we both put in money, we both work at the firm, but I do something that's really hard to observe, and Leandro does something that's really easy to observe. So Leandro's he's worried about whether I'm working hard or not. I mean, I come to work, but it looks like I'm just sitting there. I'm an academic. It looks just like I'm sitting there, and he doesn't know whether I'm working hard or not. So what I do, and I can see whether Leandro's working hard or not. So what I do is I take my checkbook out, and I give him a check for 50,000 euros. Leandro just puts the check in his pocket. It's like a promissory note. Okay? Now, as long as the cost to me of providing the effort is less than 50,000 euros, or the net present value of it is less than the 50,000 euros, and as long as the value to Leandro of our relationship is more than 50,000 euros, we've solved the problem of having a firm. So the promissory note, the check, can actually, because Leandro keeps it in his pocket, and the agreement, our agreement is, he won't cash it unless he feels like I'm not doing my job. That promissory note and that third-party enforced contract can, in fact, enable us to have a relationship. Now, here's the problem. When all elites are the same and the rules about promissory notes are the same, it doesn't matter whether Leandro is more powerful or I'm more powerful. But if we're living in an identity world, in Leandro, the Prados de la Escosura, no, that's not right. Is it? Okay, it's good, right? And I'm John Wallis, okay? I don't know what the ends of those things mean, but I think maybe when I go to court, that'll matter. So if Leandro is more powerful than I am, if I take a check from Leandro, I can't get it enforced. And I'm only going to use the check if our relationship is broken down. Leandro can take a check from me and know that he can get it enforced. Now, since I know I can't take Leandro to court and get the note enforced, I won't even take the note to start with. And what will happen is the number of agreements between elites that can be reached now that we have the elites ordered and enforcement is based on ordering looks like this. So even though we have a rule that's enforced, but it's enforced in an identity-based way, we've got half the number of exchanges that we had in the impersonal rule economy. The more powerful elite can't use the promissory note to solve the contracting problem because he can't credibly commit to honor the promissory note if the relationship breaks down. The less powerful elite can use the promissory note to solve the contracting problem. So it wouldn't be, in a society with identity rules, we would expect to see exchanges and we would expect to see contracts, but we wouldn't expect to see all the possible contracts. And so the level of income in the identity world would be lower because only half the potential exchanges could be reached and be supported. It could be a stable world where there are rules and enforcement. It just would be a poorer world in a Smithian sense. The impersonal rule society will, ceteris paribus, enjoy higher income because it'll have more productive exchanges, more division of labor. So what about the dynamics of this society through time? Well, there's sources of uncertainty in an identity rule society that don't exist in an impersonal rule society. If elite identities change through time, one group rises and another group falls, then I may not know going forward whether I'm going to be on top or I'm not going to be. Leandro's going to be on top. And as a result, the value of the promissory note to either one of us is lower because of the uncertainty about what will occur in the future. So think of someplace like Turkey today. Who's going to end up on top? Are you with Erdogan or against Erdogan? You might be with Erdogan today, and then tomorrow he's not with you, right? Those kind of societies in which social positions and identities change that create uncertainty in all kinds of dimensions, much more than just writing the promissory note. And they may mean that connections and relationships that would be sustainable if the rules were available to everybody and treated the same are not available because identities really matter. So let's suppose that there's two groups. This is a different problem. Say the Capulets and the Montagues, Shakespeare. And they trade with each other, but they're also distinct patron-client networks. So the A's are the Capulets and the B's are the Montagues. We still have the most powerful Capulet is more powerful than the most powerful Montague. So the X's are trades across the networks and the A's and B's are trades within the networks, within the families. So what happens if the relationships break down? We go to that. The Capulets and Montagues won't trade with one another. So if we have a coalition structure in which my social identity depends upon the people I'm associated with and the network, so we have Leandro and the people on this side, some of whom are elites who are part of Leandro's patronage network, and we have my people, some of you who are elites and part of my patronage networks, and suddenly relationships between Leandro and I break down, relationships between both sides will break down. In that state, you need to know which side you're on. In Spain, this is a particular poignant problem because of the way the 20th century went. It was important to know which side you were on at different points in time. And the sides didn't stay fixed through the 20th century. They moved around. So if this is a possibility, then a very small change in power can produce Smithian shrinking. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. So we think about, so this is the world with no ability to make elite connections. As we move in this direction, the economies shrink. As we move in this direction, economies grow. And they can shrink and grow with a lot of flexibility. There's no ballistics to this. There's no path of a growth path that an economy is on that it will follow if everything stays constant. Because if you're in a world where identity rules really matter, this is what Doug North and Barry Weingast and I would call a natural state, where the source of social order is not laws and rules that treat people the same, it's personal relationships between organizations. In Madrid, in 1500, you didn't know everybody who lived in Madrid, but you knew some people were connected to one group and some people were connected to another group. And there were some people you didn't cross, even though you didn't know them personally, you knew who they were. They were an identity-based society. In those societies, when the value of social identities change, things suddenly go up in the air, and those places shrink. It could be a civil war, that's the worst outcome. It just could be some uncertainty about who's going to be on top next week, or what's shifting. In that kind of world, there's going to be a lot of catch-up. Because as you go from this to this to this, the economy will become more productive. It won't be more productive because you have land and labor. It will be more productive because you have more connections and more stable relationships. I grew up in the United States, and it's just really hard for me to imagine living in a place like Syria. It's just really hard because I've never lived in a place where I've remotely feared for my physical security unless I went in the wrong neighborhood, and I knew what the neighborhoods were, so I didn't do it. I never worried that the society around me was going to break down and people were going to start killing each other. Now, obviously, I've told this is a very simple story of writing a promissory note, but there's all kinds of relationships in society in which if I need to know who you are, I'm just not going to deal with you if I don't know who you are. It may be that I just need to know what family you're from, or from what region you're from, what your ethnic or religious identity is. But those societies are going to be subject to lots of shrinking if there's any changing in identities over time. Impersonal rule societies do not eliminate shocks. They do not eliminate bad outcomes. They do not eliminate harvest failures. They do not eliminate financial breakdowns. They do not eliminate the 2008 mortgage-backed security crisis in the United States. So there's nothing about impersonal rule societies that makes them more stable in terms of fewer shocks. What makes them more stable is that when there are shocks, oops, I did it again, didn't I? There we go. When there's shocks, this matrix doesn't change. Right? There's no relationship which has been put at risk. Now, there may be relationships that are based on personality and long-term, they may shift, But relationships that are built upon the enforcement of the promissory note, they're good. So in 2008, as a result of the crisis, Goldman Sachs got sued for something like $300 million because they had taken mortgage-backed securities from somebody they knew the securities weren't good. And then later on, they got sued for not admitting it or for not telling their customers what was going on. And if you think about what Goldman Sachs said when they were being prosecuted, could Goldman Sachs ever say, we refuse to honor our obligations on a mortgage-backed security? So you remember what they are. People get mortgages, and Goldman Sachs takes 1,000 mortgages and puts it in a bundle. And people were worried that they didn't know the 1,000 mortgages in the bundle, and therefore they lost confidence in the mortgage. The market price of the mortgage-backed security dropped. Would Goldman Sachs ever want to create any doubt that it would enforce the terms of the mortgages in the bundle? No. Right? Goldman Sachs said, we want the matrix to say full. We want everybody to be able to trade with everybody, because if everybody can't trade with everybody, then we can't have a mortgage-backed security, because if we can't trade with everybody, I have to know the name of every single person in the bundle. So having rules that applied equally to everybody makes mortgage-backed securities possible. It makes kind of situations in which people can contract across shocks where the shocks just don't affect the relationships because the third party is able to enforce the rules. Oop, now I'm going back through my slides. Okay, so we don't really know why societies are so vulnerable to shrinking. I've given you some ideas, okay? And so we're just now beginning to talk about why impersonal rule societies might make societies less vulnerable to the shrinking process. This will be rule of law. It'll be public trust. It'll come across as all kinds of things. But what's happening is that the micro level relationships that people are engaged in are more stable because the rules are continuing to be enforced. Now, if that's the case, when did these societies emerge? Well, it turns out they emerged about 200 years ago, at the same time that modern economic growth started. So the United States, which is the case I know best, in the 1840s, begins to write constitutions that require general laws, impersonal rules, so that you can't, the state legislature must have a general law for creating corporations. Before that, it took a special act of the legislature. So even though the legislature was very liberal with granting charters, somebody could get turned down. Somebody could be in the group that was being helped, and somebody might be in the group that was being hurt. They passed general laws for divorce. Before that, you could go to court and get a divorce, or you could go to the legislature and get a divorce. And if you married somebody from a very powerful family, you were likely to go to the legislature and you were likely to lose in your divorce. So now what they wanted to say is, let's have a set of rules for getting divorced that doesn't depend upon your identity. It's the same for everybody. The state of Indiana in 1851 did this for a list of 17 different things. After the 1840s, the United States begins to grow. That's the first time when we can see this 1.5% growth per capita. And even though the United States has lots of financial fluctuations, it doesn't have any more civil wars, it doesn't have any more government defaults, it doesn't have any more blatant political manipulation of the economy that we see in lots of other places. So why did they do this? Right? Why would elites who enjoy preferential rules, that is, rules that favor them just in the nature of the rule, or preferential enforcement of the existing rules, why would they ever give that up in return to adopt some rules that are actually impersonally enforced? So I'm an economist. It must be that those elites gain more from impersonally enforced rules than they do from identity-based rules. There must be a gain to them from giving up their privileges. It's the difference between this graph and this graph. Okay, now what I did here in the top row is I put these ones in here because that's the contracts that the most powerful elite can enter into if there's impersonal rules. And here's the number of contracts that the most powerful elite can enter into if there's identity rules. That's the paradox of privilege. The privileged are privileged. They're better off. But there's certain things they can't do. They can't use the laws to bind themselves because they're powerful. Okay? So the gains are not symmetric. I've still got a few more minutes, so I'll talk just a little bit more before saying thank you for listening, but thank you for listening. How do they rationalize this? So we've been talking about liberal today in different ways. So think about classic liberalism. Think about Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations is written in 1776, and people in Europe say, this guy's a Francophile. He wants to help poor people, all this kind of stuff. And it's not the kind of modern interpretation of Adam Smith we give, which is for markets and property rights and keeping government small. What happens between 1776 and 1826 is people start reading Adam Smith differently. And elites in Britain who were worried about, and Europe, were worried about what Adam Smith was saying in 1776, now read Adam Smith as saying, we need to have rules that treat everybody the same. We need to have governments that don't create privileged corporations. We need to have governments that don't single out privileges for one group or another as a way to provide for political stability. In the work that I did with North and Weingast and some papers that I've written about the concept of systematic corruption, in most societies, you hold the political system together by creating rents for private actors. And that means that you cannot have impersonal rules, because you got to know who you're dealing with. At the beginning of the 19th century, the people who started reading Adam Smith saying we need to have a government that treats everybody the same, it wasn't the people storming the Bastille, right? It was people who wanted to trade more. It's people who wanted commerce and development. And elites who had previously been privileged realized in an articulate kind of way that we should be, if we move to rules that provide the same protections for everybody, and really what they meant in the United States, this is Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, all of whom owned slaves, who they were not freeing. So when they said impersonal rules, they didn't really mean impersonal rules for everybody. They meant impersonal rules for elites. They meant we got to get rid of those numbers, and we have to have rules that treat all elites the same. Now, that doesn't sound like modern progressivism, okay? Because the elites were privileged, but the elites were saying we need to change our privileges so that one group of elites is not more privileged than another. Is there a way to create equality? And it's interesting to hear the word equality come out of the mouth of people who own slaves and say all men are created equal. Because what they meant was we need to have a group of people that we recognize as citizens who are full participant, and all of those people needed to be created equally. And they were living in societies in which elites were not treated equally. You did not turn your back on the king. If you owned the shares of a company that the king owned shares in, the value to you was the expected dividend flows and income flows plus the asset value of the corporation if it went bankrupt. But if you owned shares in a company with the king and the company went bankrupt, who was going to get made whole first? The king. And you had to know how many shares the king owned before you could figure out how much your shares was worth. And so the king says, tell you what, I promise I'll get in line just like everybody else. Whether that was credible or not, probably not. Certainly not in 1800. But when the king managed to do that, what happened to the value of everybody's shares? Oops. Now, I'm not arguing in any sense that you're going to go back and find this killer quote where, the king of Spain says, I'm giving up my shares. Or, okay, that's not the process that occurred. But what happened sometime in the late 18th and early 19th century is that societies begin to say these notions of equality, which today we read as meaning everybody, began to be applied to powerful elites who began to forge rules that they could credibly enforce. Of course, that means they had to have rules that were credible, that were identity-based to begin with, because they had to believe that they had rules they could enforce that would treat everybody the same. And when they did that, it wasn't that their economies grew because productivity went up immediately. It was that they stopped having these negative relationships. They stopped having these negative events in which the economy shrunk. They managed to stabilize relationships between parts of the economy and people in the economy in such a way that a vibrant commercial society, it was not insulated from shocks by any sense, but it was insulated from politics and social identity in a particular kind of way. Now we can look back and think about this as the separation of economics and politics, and that's very classically liberal, right? That the government should not be manipulating the economy. And I agree with that. But it also means that the tools that were available to the economy changed. The government was intimately involved in the economy. It was intimately involved in enforcing these contracts, which now had no element of personal identity in them. People wrote contracts, they still had business relationships that were based on, did you know the person you were trading with? The contract was maybe there like the promissory note, just in the background. But having impersonal rules in the background meant that the whole society was more stable and worked better and stopped shrinking and started growing. Thank you.